Welcome everyone to Love Over Coffee. This is a platform and a podcast for the marginalized, the silenced, and the abused. And I want to give people a little bit of a chance to join us on TikTok. Let me share us out to a few people that I know as regulars. And hopefully other people will share us out as well. So my name is Tina Durbin, and I am the podcast host for Love Over Coffee, Voices Now Heard. I'm going to play a countdown, and then I will introduce our guest. So for those of you who are unaware, October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And in recognition of, I guess in regard to the fact that I'm a survivor and so many others that I know are also survivors, including our guest tonight, Lyndsay Deaver, I want to bring awareness to the issue by hosting 31 nights. This is actually the third annual 31 nights of this podcast. This podcast started June 1st of 2021, which was World Narcissistic Abuse Awareness Day. And from that point forward, we have been having weekly guests. And then Gabby Petito, that case occurred in September of 2021. And in honor of Gabby Petito and so many others whose voices have been silenced, I started the 31 nights. And so I am humbled and honored to bring to you a woman that I actually know quite well, although she has not seen me in a while. And so this is Lyndsay Deaver. As far as I know, she's still with Greenhouse 17, which is a domestic violence shelter here in Lexington. And then she's also a victim's advocate, I believe, for a local police department. So I want to bring to you Lyndsay Deaver. And Lyndsay, I ask the same question that I always ask, and that is, tell us who you are, where you've been, where you're going, and please tell us only what you feel comfortable and safe sharing. And so welcome in.
Thank you so much, Tina. Wow, that's okay. Big introduction. Let's see. My name is Lyndsay. I've worked in one way or another with Greenhouse 17 since 2009. Currently, I do facilitate a support group about twice a month for Greenhouse in Lexington. And I'm a victim's advocate for Georgetown Police Department full time. So I kind of get to be part of both worlds in advocacy, which is systems-based and community-based advocacy. And I really enjoy being able to connect people to resources in both of those worlds.
And I met her through the support group at a local church. I started attending with a friend of mine because as much as I was away from the situation, I still hadn't really, I guess, reconciled in my mind that I wasn't the only one and that I wasn't crazy. And so I found Lyndsay's support group for survivors to basically come together. And the number one thing I realized, sadly, but importantly, was that I wasn't alone, that I wasn't the crazy one, and that the abuse cycle is real. So, can you tell us a little bit about the abuse cycle, Lyndsay?
Yeah, sure. Well, typically it kind of, at the very beginning of a relationship, and I mean, you could probably say this is most relationships, they start off, with all the butterflies and the warm fuzzies and the gifts and happy feelings and everything. And sometimes in abusive relationships, it's characterized as a little bit more extreme. at the beginning, and we call that love bombing. So, or some people call it the honeymoon period.
I was going to say, is there a difference between those two things? Because I've always thought of the honeymoon period as the time after the abuse has occurred.
Well, but I mean, because it is a cycle, that's kind of like it starts out in that.
Right,
So
right.
the honeymoon period is more of a kind of a general term across the board that is commonly experienced in a lot of relationships, regardless if they are going to be abusive or not. I think most people have a honeymoon period because you have a new person who is interested in you and getting to know you, and so everything is new and exciting, and you're kind of on your best behavior early on.
Right.
You don't want to show them any of your flaws right away. And so the honeymoon period, I think, is more of a universal experience, but it is also a term that we use within the context of the cycle of abuse. And you're right, it does follow. So traditionally, we describe the cycle as starting out in the honeymoon period, and then over time it kind of tapers off, maybe gradually. The newness wears off, and you start to get annoyed by little things. And it's sort of called the tension building period at that point, where there might be some minor disagreements or whatever, but they're probably not being directly communicated about or addressed, like in a healthy relationship. So you're sort of trying to keep this other person happy if you are on the receiving end of this, and they might seem kind of moody, or they might be giving you like the silent treatment and that kind of thing. And then gradually that leads up to some kind of incident of abuse where it kind of comes to a head and causes a fight of some kind. It can look very different between different relationships. It could be a fight, it could be an extreme, it could just be yelling and verbal stuff, or it could become physical. It could be throwing things or breaking things, or in being destructive in some way or another. Obviously it's an act of abuse, and it's kind of this like explosion. And usually what follows that fight incident or abusive incident is another honeymoon period where the abuser is apologetic. They might buy you gifts, they might promise to go to therapy, they might whatever they think that they need to say or do to make it worthwhile for you to stick around, because you just saw the ugly side of things. So this is a general, like I said, it's not identical in every relationship, but over time, what you find is that cycle keeps repeating itself. And usually the honeymoon period gets shorter and shorter until it may almost disappear. The honeymoon period might just turn into, the absence of fighting and abuse.
I never thought of it that way. Lyndsay.
Yeah.
So when you're being, because I can only relate by stories I've heard, and of course my own story. But what about when there is no physical component? So the relationship that I was in was completely narcissistically abusive. And there was definitely a major love bombing period. There were definitely what I would call the table flip moment. Okay. And then I spent the rest of the relationship trying to flip the table back. But the mental and emotional abuse, I didn't really realize what was happening. So how does that fit in? Is that part of is the mental and emotional part of the love bombing grooming stage? Where does it fit in?
I mean, honestly, I think it fits in I think that is kind of an ongoing thing for some abusive relationships. It is like, well, because they may, during love bombing, kind of put you up on a pedestal and praise and just, oh my gosh, you're just the most wonderful person they've ever met, never been with. They're so lucky to have you. All of these type of
Oh yeah, I heard
very
all that.
extravagant type of, praise. And so it doesn't seem like that is abusive. Obviously, when it's happening, it feels really good to be talked about that way and praised. But what I always say is the higher up you climb, the farther you have to fall. So,
Mm.
and I'm not saying that any of this is always a conscious thing that abusers do. It's almost like second nature for them because it is something that they probably have observed and learned from a very early age. So they're not always really even aware that they're doing these things. But it's if you're sitting on the outside observing it, it's a very clear kind of pattern. So yeah, they start out with, all of the praise and kind of building you up like this, and then what happens is in the abusive incident, in that non-physical type of abusive relationship, it's more going to be put downs and, undermining all of that praise, just saying terrible things about you, calling you names, making you question your own reality, basically, and your own even intentions, because they have a way of kind of manipulating and twisting around your words to use against you.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're constantly spending time trying to justify what you said or did, and because they know, like, if you have a conscience and you're being accused of, bad intentions, and that's absolutely not what you're doing, it's very frustrating to be in that position. You're like, oh my gosh, no, I'm not. That's not at all what I meant.
Lyndsay, did you live in my house? Did you live in my house and I didn't know it? Because I tell you what, yeah. I mean, everything you're saying, and the thing is, I didn't make any connections because while I've said before, squares are rectangles, but rectangles are not squares. Abusers are not all narcissistic, but narcissistic people are abusers. And so if you end up with an abuser where it's, I don't want to say more obvious, but I think the more obvious form of abuse that we think of is physical. When they hit you, you know you've been hit. But when you've been hit mentally and emotionally, it's a very different experience because instead of seeing the scars on the outside, many times the scars are on the inside and they are triggering scars from prior relationships or perhaps childhood or perhaps another whatever. And you don't realize that it's all playing into the same circle, and it's really hard to change the circle because you just are going round and round and round, and you don't realize until you realize. Either you give it a name or somebody helps you give it a name or something. um, so when someone calls Greenhouse 17 and they are just like desperate for answers, I know I called the domestic hotline 1-800-799-8233. I called it several times thinking, I don't know what's going on, but this is what's happening. And and the person would just listen. So is that what Greenhouse 17 does as well? I mean, do you help people to label it as abuse, or do you just listen to them talk and then
Yeah. People call the hotline at Greenhouse for all different reasons. Sometimes they're very aware that they are being abused and they just don't really know what to do or where to turn. Sometimes they may be really confused and be getting, hearing completely different things from people in their life, or, their own understanding of what's going on and what they're being told is going on is conflicting, and so they call to get some perspective. Um,
Mm.
and the folks at Greenhouse that answer the 24-hour hotline are advocates. You know, they're right there in the building, but they have, you know, the knowledge of what these patterns are and what types of abuse can look like. And so sometimes the first step is identifying it as abuse, because people, you know, aren't sure, is this abuse or is it not? And then they're describing what's going on, and then the advocate's able to say, yes, that's financial abuse, or that's emotional abuse, or, you know, that these, it kind of puts it into a context that the person is able to get some clarity about what they've been experiencing. And that,
That was me. That was me calling and just saying, I don't know what's going on. I'm so confused about what's going on, but basically, I'm paying for everything, and they were like, and they would ask questions to help me clarify. And as I answered, I think one of the most helpful things is, and I know sometimes that you call the domestic hotline and they don't always have an immediate answer and they don't always have an immediate resource. But Lyndsay, have you found that sometimes it just helps to verbalize it the first time? Because I know for me, like hearing myself say that I was possibly being abused opened my eyes to what I was saying and putting it together with what I was feeling,
mm-hmm.
even though I was still confused, I actually like voiced it out. And then it was like, oh, yeah, okay. Um, because I think that's many times the hardest part is like making that phone call and making that switch.
Yeah, it definitely is, because it changes your way of thinking about the problem. Because before you identify that it is abuse, a lot of times survivors are kind of going around and round and around in circles going, what could I have done differently? Well, maybe I should have done this differently. You know, and they're sort of exhausting all possible alternative choices they could have made, because the abuser has, you know, made this somehow their fault, whatever has happened. Right. And so they're in problem solving mode, directing towards themselves, as far as like, because you want to feel like you have some agency in this situation. You know, if you have some control over something that you did, you could do differently, then, you know, that gives you the power to change the future outcomes. And so it's kind of difficult to transition sometimes for someone to come to the realization that, and usually it's after it's happened many times, and you start to kind of feel defeated, like, well, no matter what I do, it's never the right thing. And
that was me. Yeah, I started realizing this is crazy.
Yeah. And so sometimes hearing somebody else tell you, no, this is not your fault, this is abuse that you're experiencing because these are, you know, tactics a person's using to control you, that it can, I'm sure it's an emotional roller coaster, because it could be a relief to hear that, like, oh my gosh, it's not my fault this whole time. Oops, my phone tipped a little bit. It can be a relief, but it can also be really sad, because it also means that you don't actually have the ability to, you know, change the problem or fix the problem all on your own. The other person is not invested in taking responsibility for their own part, you know, what they are doing in this situation, then you really do have to find a way out at that
because point. The hard part is, I know for me, I mean, I've been told since I was a little girl, be the change you want to see in the world, and you can change the world, and you can fix the world, and you find out that you can't fix people who don't want to change, and that's hard to hear, because as you said, all I wanted to do was like what I turned it all inward though. What can I do? What can I say? What can I not do? What can I not say? How can I change what is happening? But the cycle is repeating, and at some point you realize that you're just in the hamster wheel, and it's just going round and round and round, and you don't know how to get on, and you don't know how to get off. You're just on it. You're just there.
Yeah.
So, what are the forms of abuse? Because I think we know about physical, but what are the other aspects of or forms of abuse, I guess?
Okay. So I should be able to do all this by memory now, shouldn't I? After so many years. So the power and control wheel, which I can get out and have like a visual if you want me to show
If
this.
you want to, that's fine. I can put you on the screen by yourself.
Okay,
It might be a little bigger for people to see.
let me pull it out of here. Oops. Oh, don't tell me I've given them all away.
That's possible. Always in need of copies, I'm sure.
I may need to make more copies, but that's okay. Oh, here we go. Here we go. All right.
Power, okay, power and control, okay.
Yes. Okay. So, and I'll show it again at the end. But this wheel is context for abuse, and people who aren't having experience or aren't familiar with abuse and relationships don't realize that it is all for power and control. So the abuser's usually bottom line is not to hurt you. Their goal is to control you and to have power and more power in the relationship so that it's not an equal relationship. Um, so these things that are on this power and control wheel are all different ways that an abuser uses to have the upper hand, more or less. So economic abuse. Here, I'll show it again. Right here. That can look a lot of different ways. It can be that the abuser convinces you to quit your job, or takes opportunity when you already wanted to quit your job to kind of sweeten the deal and offer, oh, don't worry, I have a good job, I can pay all the bills. And at first, when you're feeling safe and secure in that relationship, that sounds great. But then over time you realize now you don't have the financial agency that you previously had in this relationship, because if you're depending on somebody else to pay all of these bills, you may not have access to the bank account. You may not have like equal shared ability to access your household's money. So sometimes that's one way that they do financial abuse, or they can also just kind of abruptly quit their job, and suddenly it's up to you to pay all of these bills that you previously were sharing. So that kind of monopolizes all of your income, and you don't have the option to save money, because now you're living paycheck to paycheck. You can't put anything aside if you were wanting to have something to fall back on if you needed to leave. It's expensive to move, it's expensive to do everything, but it really kind of makes it so that a survivor is in a position to be stuck where they are. So that's one piece of the pie. Using coercion and threats, and that's really a broad category. It can be any kind of threat, a threat to share your personal information with others that you didn't give them permission, basically making it not worth saying no, whatever it is that they want you to do, just kind of wearing you down, or saying, well, if you don't do this for me, then I'm not going to do this thing that you really were depending on me to do. It can be really serious threats, like, obviously harm to self or to you or to themselves. So that's one thing we definitely highlight, because mental health is, definitely a factor, and it's always important to talk about depression and the risk of suicide. But there are abusers that use that threat as, a way, like a last ditch effort to get you not to leave. And it's pretty effective, because nobody wants that on their conscience, or to feel like, oh, well, maybe it was my fault. It's never your fault if somebody decides to take their own life, but it's also really one thing to say that, and another thing for you to truly believe that, if you are the survivor of somebody that makes that threat. But they can make any type of threat. You can use your imagination. Using intimidation, I usually describe intimidation as anything that scares you, or basically tells you that they could cause harm to you or someone that you love and care about, without directly doing that. So that can be punching a hole in the wall, or ripping up a picture that's important to you, or destroying your property. It can be hurting your pets. It's an awful way that they get you to, in the moment, to acquiesce to whatever it is that they're wanting. Emotional abuse, that's a really broad category too, using put downs. A popular term you hear all the time, gaslighting, is kind of altering your own sense of reality. So basically, they will just either straight up deny whatever happened, to the degree that you start to question your own memory of what happened, or like the classic original example is it a play or a movie? I think it was a play, but the Gaslight play, which is where he's just like turning down the gas lamps in the house before electricity, just slightly whenever she's out of the room, so that when she comes back, she's like, is it dark in here? And he's like, no, it's totally normal. So that's the concept, but we also call it crazy making. It's that completely denying your perspective and not being willing to consider how you feel about something, so vehemently that you start to question your own perspective of reality.
Lyndsay, we have a question on TikTok.
Sure.
Is the silent treatment in that? Where does silent treatment fall?
I would say silent treatment is a tactic of emotional abuse, and there's an important distinction to make, because I also in my group teach, I actually, now that I think about it, I need to go back over this again, but the fair fighting rules, which is a set of rules for healthy relationships, where you can have a healthy way of having conflict or disagreements. And the distinction between a silent treatment and taking a break so that you can cool down, and because if this isn't going anywhere productive, because you're both in your feelings, and you need to step away and not talk about whatever the topic of disagreement is. The only distinction really in that is communicating why you need to stop, you need to withdraw from the situation, and stop talking about it, and also agreeing that you're going to return to that at a later point when things have cooled off. So I like to make sure that there's a distinction. The silent treatment is when you have no idea what the problem is. You might just come to work and your partner is not talking to you and they're stomping around, they're ignoring anything that you say, they're
Slamming all the cabinets in the kitchen, but
yes,
not telling you why they're slamming the cabinets in the kitchen. Yeah.
yeah, yes, bit loud sighs, and it's like, and if you say like, what's wrong, and they might say nothing, or they may not answer you at all, they might just completely stonewall you. So that's a toxic, not helpful tactic. And what happens with survivors that go through this, especially this cycle where they get to that abusive incident where there's like an explosion, the silent treatment is scary because they feel like, oh my gosh, it's like a ticking time bomb,
Mm-hmm.
then it's going to go off. And so in some situations, I've, spoken to some survivors that have developed this kind of coping mechanism that isn't really helpful in the long term, but it serves a purpose in this toxic cycle, and that is to kind of like instigate the fight to get it over with. Because you can't stand being ignored and stonewalled like this with the silent treatment. So that's I guess another topic, but yeah, so I would say that is emotional abuse. If you are completely shutting down and not communicating what the issue is because you just want that other person to be on eggshells and, to be super anxious about this unaddressed issue that they don't know, because then you could be like guessing, well, what did I do? Did I do this? Is it about this other thing that happened the other day? Or, you're racking your brain and you're giving a lot of energy to this for no reason, for no good end, I guess, trying to come up with what you could possibly have done to deserve the silent treatment. So like I said, I distinguish that from taking a break because you have to communicate. And you can't always do that. If it's an abusive relationship, truly, they aren't going to respect your boundaries as far as like, you know what, we need to take a break and cool off from this right now. So if you have tried to set that boundary or tried to, take a step back to let everybody calm down and that's not respected, then you might, you're at least in an unhealthy relationship, if not an abusive one. I hope that answers that question.
Thank you.
Yeah. Let's see. Okay. We've talked about economic abuse, using coercion and threats, using intimidation, using emotional abuse, and using isolation. This one is really important, and I say that this one makes all of these other ones worse because if you take away someone's support systems, and it could be like a physical removal where you actually relocate to a different state or someplace very rural, where you may not have your own transportation, whatever it is, you could be physically isolated that way. So it's like, well, you have nowhere to go if the closest neighbor is a mile away and you need to get out of the situation, you don't have a vehicle, you kind of have to make it work, or it can be more like social isolation where the abuser is trying to distance you from your friends and family if they are your support system. And they do that in various clever ways. Sometimes they'll say stuff like, they'll just talk bad about your friends or say like, highlight your friends' negative traits or flaws and say, I don't think that person, deserves to be your friend and they're not, whatever, they're not a good influence on you. And they just will talk really negatively about this person to the point where you're like, okay, well, even if you don't believe those things, it's like to avoid listening to all of that nonsense, you're going to, start to kind of back up away from that relationship. Or it can be that they just make it, at the beginning, I always use this example. Oh, please cancel your plans. Like, I just really want to be with you tonight, or I just really want to, I just want to spend all my time with you, whatever, something kind of romantic-esque. And so at first you're like, oh, that's so sweet. Like, of course I can always reschedule this other thing. And you're kind of in a position to like choose between this partner or your friend and your plans that you
Well,
made.
and Lindsay, I realized as I look back now that as much as I was being groomed and honeymooned or whatever, my friends were too. Because in the beginning, everything that I was doing, he wanted to do with me.
Mm.
But then over time, as I continued to want to do those things, that's when I realized, well, now you don't want to go out, and now you don't want to go out with my friends, and now you're saying these things about my friends. As I look back, I see the pattern. But at the time, he seemed all about my friends in the beginning until he didn't want to be all about my friends anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's interesting too. That's like those are some of those more charming types. Well,
Sociopath, I call them.
you like swoop in and make a really good first impression on your friends, and so then it kind of puts you in this position of like wanting to preserve their reputation to your friends,
Yes.
because everybody wants, their, or I shouldn't say everybody, most people want their friends to get along with their partner and like their partner too,
Right.
right? And so if they do that really well at first, that's the first impression the friends have, then you're less likely to talk bad about them to
That's true.
because
Yep.
you kind of are investing like, well, maybe they'll turn a corner and start improving or do these things, go to therapy, whatever, it'll get better like it used to be. And so you're holding off and you're more hesitant to say anything negative about this person. And then you kind of build yourself into a little box of, well, when do you want to cross that threshold of actually things haven't been so great, and open the can of worms per se.
It can take a while because and now that we live in the world of social media, lots of people put out there when things are great, but they don't put out there when things are bad. And it's not like there aren't bad things that go on in the world, whether it be one's mental health issues, even in a single person's life. But when you have pumped something up as though it is this grandiose thing, and then you have to go back and say, no, really, he's an asshole. Um, and especially if, in my case, I had a series of what I would call baby narc relationships with jerks that I basically dated for a short period of time and then got rid of.
Mm-hmm.
But this last one was so manipulative and so grooming, that he was everything I thought he was and more until I found out he was really nothing. But, the others were just jerks sooner and I saw it. Whereas this one manipulated longer and it took longer for the mask to fall off, as they say. So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that usually that's like the narcissists get bored easily. And so whenever they get bored, they stop putting in any effort to try to hide who they really
are. Right.
Because then they've got to jazz things up a little, create some drama to avoid the boredom, I guess. I don't know. Not all of them, but a lot of them do.
Right.
So let's see. I covered isolation, physical and social isolation. All right. The next one is minimizing, denying, and blaming. And I always say this also ties directly into that gaslighting kind of stuff. Minimizing the abuse, saying it wasn't that bad, or you're making a mountain out of a molehill. Straight up denying that they said or did those things, and oftentimes in these abusive incidents, alcohol may be involved, and so it's easier to convince somebody that their memory is off because it's like it's a what do they call it, amnesiac, or so it takes ability to really nail down your memories, and so then you're more vulnerable to having your own memories and perspective denied and being like, well, maybe it didn't happen that way, you know? And then also just blaming all of it on you. Well, I wouldn't have done that if you didn't make me so mad, or if you just, did what you're supposed to do, or whatever, shifting that they're not going to take responsibility for the abusive behavior. So yeah, that's also another one that it really gets inside of your head and makes it difficult to really see clearly what's going on. The next piece of the pie, horrible pie, is using children, and I would amend this. I think nowadays I say using children or pets. They will use what they know is valuable to you, and most of the time, if you are a human or pet parent, either one, your children are going to be the top of your list. So those are high value negotiation pieces to them. So they can say things like, especially if the abuser is a parent of the children too, why are you trying to tear our family apart? And really use those kids to manipulate you into thinking like, if you leave, you are destroying our family. That's your choice, not mine. And that is super harmful to survivors and trying to leave and create a safer environment for their kids. And same thing with pets, especially if they have been paying for the vet bills or whatever, they'll say, well, if you leave, you're not taking, Scruffy with you. He's staying here with me. Now in Kentucky and in many other states, but only recently, I think last year, they changed the EPO application. If you want to get a protective order, you can add your pets to the protective order now.
Wow, really?
Yep. So that was a big win, in my opinion, for survivors in Kentucky that are trying to leave, because we know from research that having to leave behind pets is a huge obstacle.
Mm-hmm. I know many women and men who have stayed in relationships because they didn't want to leave the pet.
Yeah.
And I know people might think that's crazy, but I know for me, I didn't get a pet until after the relationship, but it was such an emotional support
Mm-hmm.
after. But I can only imagine that during the relationship, it is also an emotional support. It's the same thing when you deal with homelessness. There are a lot of shelters that won't take a pet, and there are some people who won't go to a shelter because they have a pet.
Yeah.
And they won't sleep in a shelter.
Since that is, you just brought that up, I want to also say to anybody in Kentucky, at least, that is watching this, that there is a low barrier shelter in Louisville, called Wayside Christian Mission, that allows you to bring pets.
Oh, wow. That's awesome.
It's not
Lyndsay.
for domestic violence. It's a homeless shelter, but they
But
do have, folks with animals. And that's so I try to share that information as much as I can, because I only in the past year or a couple of years maybe learned about that. And I think that's awesome. And I hope that we see more shelters that do that. Greenhouse 17 also does, on a case-by-case basis, kind of allow people to bring a pet with them if they are fleeing a domestic abusive situation. And if they're not able to bring the pet with them to shelter because it's not good in the shelter environment, we do have the ability to place them into foster homes temporarily.
awesome.
Yeah, and it's an anonymous, tax deductible donation. So I also wanted to put that out there for anyone, because someone watching might be interested in volunteering to be a foster. So if anyone's interested in that, please reach out to me, and I would be happy to add you to our list of potential fosters.
Yeah, because like I said, I know so many. When I worked at the church, I knew so many homeless with pets that would not go to a shelter because they would not take the pet, and they were sleeping in cars and sleeping outside and sleeping in doorways and all kinds of things so that they could keep their animal with them. And so that is a very real barrier, to sometimes getting someone who's homeless off the street. And like I said, I also know it's the same case with domestic violence victims. Somebody wants to know what states. Do you know what states it is, Lyndsay?
Which states for what?
What states allow pets in some shelters for domestic violence and or
In shelters? I mean, I think if you go to, I think it's Red Rover,
mm-hmm.
Red Rover, or pet safety, domestic violence, put those kind of keywords in.
Mm-hmm.
There is a list of programs in
Okay.
all the states that allow pets. I don't know that every single state has,
Right.
but there is also a grant program, I believe, through Purina called Purple Leash, which I'm glad one of my friends just reminded me of that the other day. But Purple Leash is, you can apply for funding to help with temporarily fostering animals.
Oh wow.
Yeah. So there's
That's
a lot.
awesome. Okay.
And there's a lot of grants kind of popping up now for that purpose, because it's kind of a hot topic since there's been more research on domestic violence and pets, and how that is, usually if there's domestic violence and there's pets in the home, the pets are also victims of that. So there's a big push to try to provide more inclusive services that allow survivors to take their pets with them, or in one way or another make sure that their pets are safe.
And the pandemic also opened up the knowledge base that domestic violence, when you're stuck in the house with the abuser through the pandemic, there were more cases of people reporting domestic violence, and now we're dealing with more couch surfing, I guess, because we're not able to, the economy post pandemic, the eviction rate is very high. The neighborhoods where you used to be able to live are no longer as cheap as they used to be, and so lots of people are couch surfing, that kind of thing. And again, not everyone can take a pet. If someone lives in an apartment that can't take a pet, then you're kind of limited. But foster for your pet while you can live with your friend that can't take a pet. It
Yeah.
all makes sense that these are things that we need to think about.
Yeah.
Angel, you may need to leave and come back in. I'm not sure exactly. And somebody wants to know, the I guess, Susan, you would probably have to look up on maybe Google where the states are that allow the protection order to include the pets, which I think that also makes a lot of sense, because usually the pet, like the children, are used as pawns. Sorry, it might have been my fingers, or I'm trying. I know that I'm trying to not breathe into the phone because I have to hold the phone up because TikTok doesn't allow me to stream so directly. So it was probably me. So when someone comes to the police department, see, that's because I'm not a professional, Nicole. When someone comes to the police department, what is the first thing that you try to ascertain, and do you walk them through the process of filing a protection order, deciding if they need to file one, or do you just encourage everyone to file one? What's that process look like, Lyndsay?
Okay, real quick, I want to go back and just say.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I just quickly found it. There's 36 states as well as Washington D.C. and Puerto Rico that have laws that include pets and protected and protection orders.
Ah,
So
36 states, guys.
Yeah, that's so most of them actually.
Wow, that's a lot more than I would have thought. Okay, good to know.
We're going places.
Right, absolutely.
Okay, so can I finish talking about the? I know we have.
Yes. No, we're fine. We're fine.
One more pie piece on this wheel of power and control that I wanted to cover before we moved on to your next excellent question.
Okay.
And that one is, and the traditional way that it's stated is as using male privilege, but since this has not been updated in a long time, I tell people, and I think that most advocates would agree with me, that abusers will use any privilege, any type of privilege. So that could be male privilege, it could be race privilege, it could be socioeconomic privilege, it could be citizenship status privilege.
Yes.
So there's lots of other types of privilege, not just male privilege. But for example, male privilege is sort of like enforcing those traditional gender role expectations and saying, oh, I don't have to do household chores because I'm the man. So that's your job. Or I get to make all these final decisions in the relationship because I'm the man, that kind of stuff. But like you can use your imagination in those other scenarios, how they could also use.
Lyndsay, I was in one with the, and I don't want to say it was the racial privilege because I guess those two things don't necessarily go together in the sense that my own situation was an interracial relationship that we were working to be the change we wanted to see in the world, but the only one I was allowed to serve as far as the change was him. Mm-hmm. And so my community efforts and things were starting to be devalued and detracted from and screamed about. And he controlled me by saying I wasn't like other white women. But then when I called the police, I was just like the white woman who called the police on Emmett Till. So it was like, it played both sides of that racial coin, and for a long time it definitely confused all the activism work I'd been involved in because it didn't make any sense to me, but it was another way to spin the words, basically.
That what you just described as more of that emotional manipulation and abuse, because he knows what he's got to say to get you to do what he wants you to do, which is going to stop asking for help or make you think twice before in a situation where you normally would ask for help.
Yes.
So that, I think that's a very emotionally manipulative tactic. But in the reverse scenario, if the abuser, and I see this quite often, where the abuser is a citizen and the victim is that they will tell them all kinds of things like, oh, well, if we go to court, you're going to get deported, or they'll never listen to you because you aren't an American, or, that kind of thing.
Okay.
You can, it's not hard to imagine how that could stop somebody from leaving or from getting resources and help that they entitled to. So that's I have covered the whole power and control wheel.
Okay, and someone wants you to send that wheel to me or something, and I can print it out, I can mail it out, I can make it available, I can do whatever need to do. So okay.
Sure, I'll send it to you. Okay, so now I'll go back to your question about how I help people at the police department. I'm here, to help people that have questions, if they maybe aren't sure yet if they want to make a police report, or if they're not sure, they may not even know what, an emergency protective order is, and kind of explaining what that process is to them and what type of protections that could give them, and any other types of resources that are available that they may be interested in. And so usually I start out by just asking them what's going on, and they kind of give me a rundown of what they've been dealing with. And if there is something in there that is, I think, a reportable crime, then I will let them know, like, that you can make a police report if you'd like to press charges on this. Not everybody wants to do that, and that's fine. They don't have to in order to get help from me. So that's a nice thing about this job, is like, I want people to feel comfortable talking to me about stuff without feeling like, I'm going to force them to suddenly be jumping into the deep end of the criminal justice system.
Which, yeah.
I want to give them a realistic expectation of what it's going to look like, because if you watch Law and Order and or IS or NCIS or whatever those shows are, and you think, we're going to send some DNA off and it's going to come back the next day or something insane.
Right. Or just in a few hours, Lyndsay.
It worked that way. That would be awesome, but it doesn't. It's very, very long, time-consuming process, and it's frustrating for a lot of people, because you could get all the way through, preliminary hearings. You could get from, it goes from district court at the lower level if it's a felony, up through the process to circuit court, and it could get all the way to grand jury, and then it could get dropped by grand jury. And that's very frustrating for folks that, have experienced that. So I want to explain it in a way that is as honest for survivors as possible, and also pros and cons, and helping them understand, what they're going to get out of whatever they decide to do. But yes, I do help them file protective orders, make sure that, they get any and all protections that they feel they need, or at least that they ask for. So I don't get to make those decisions, unfortunately, but that we make sure we ask for everything that they need, and that we consider all the kind of nuances of each individual situation.
Right. And so, can you give us any statistics? So we hear 1 in 4 women are abused, 1 in 6. I've heard 1 in 9 men are abused. What are the statistics for the number of cases that are filed? Any numbers? And if not tonight, you can certainly,
yeah, I can definitely. I'm trying to quickly Google. Do you mean like here specifically, or nationally?
Well, I guess here specifically, I'm curious about Kentucky, and is it similar across the nation, or do you find that, I know that Connecticut has a coercive control law. I know that Hawaii also has a coercive control law. Does Kentucky have coercive control? Because I know I was told that I could not file anything regarding coercive control unless there had also been a physical altercation or violence. So again, is that state to state?
Do you mean criminally specifically, or do you mean like for protective orders?
I guess it was for criminal, like filing. Well, I actually don't know, because I filed a protection order, and that was granted for 1 year. The individual that I was with, something left off that wheel is legal abuse. So I was involved in legal abuse and abuse by proxy for 5 years post relationship breakup. And so the legal abuse was him using the system to file all kinds of things against me. So I don't really know. I think at one time I was going to maybe file charges against him for harassment, um, or for coercive control. Um,
Yeah,
but they said I couldn't file for emotional abuse because there was no physical altercations, something along those lines. Maybe it's changed. It's been 6 years, but
we have any laws with specifically with that wording of coercive control. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to prove things that don't
mhm.
create evidence. So that's kind of a developing area, I think, in the justice system. But
Yeah, that's what Connecticut's finding too.
yeah, those laws are hard to enforce. But there's different ways we can approach specific situations. So like uh, depending, I'm struggling to come up with like good examples on the fly. But if you're being threatened to do something, that's a crime.
Mm. Mhm.
If extortion is a crime. Those are sort of some ways abusers, think they can get away with it. And it's not very often that we have enough evidence, but if there's a lot of, text message communication or voicemails and that kind of thing.
That's another thing I was going to say. Where are we with cyber harassment? Has there been much progress in the regulation of cyber harassment? Because abuse by proxy means people reaching out to you that you don't know, but who know the abuser, who are trying to find out information from you to give back to the abuser. So, abuse by proxy, but also posting online, drive-bys online, pictures taken. I know there's some states that have included revenge porn
Yeah.
in their laws because pictures you sent to the abuser when things were great are then posted online when things are not so great because it's a way to, I'll post this if you don't do this. So where are we in regard to some of the cyber bullying and harassment? Because when I looked it up, a lot of it's still related to schools, Lyndsay.
Yeah. Yeah. We're slowly getting there, but we're not
Right.
where I'd like us to be. I think we do have revenge porn law. Hold on,
Mm-hmm.
this up really quick. Um, yes, it is. As of 2018, it's a crime in Kentucky to post online private erotic matter of another person without their written consent. If the intent is to harm, harass, intimidate, threaten, or coerce,
Mm-hmm.
and that he or she would suffer harm as a result. So
Okay.
that is a law, the revenge porn, but there's a lot of limitations to other types of online harassment and bullying that are very difficult to.
Vague and gray.
Yeah.
I
um
wanted to just say briefly for those of you who are joining us on TikTok, my name is Tina, and yes, I'm a journaler, but I am also a survivor of domestic violence, especially narcissistic abuse, or in particular, narcissistic abuse. And so, for the 31 nights in October, I am bringing awareness to the issue of domestic violence during October, which is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, in addition to mental health awareness, depression awareness, breast cancer survivor, and also infant loss, particularly on October 15th. Um, so I don't want to minimize any of those other causes, but for me personally, this is a passionate topic because I myself am a survivor and I am in a community of survivors, and there are lots of women I know who don't always have the voice to speak out. And there are some voices that have been permanently silenced due to domestic violence. And so I want to do what I can. It's not just a topic we should talk about in October, but but I'm taking advantage of the thought process of the world right now, thinking about Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So if you've happened in, that's what we're doing. So my guest tonight is Lyndsay Deaver. She is a victims advocate with a local police department, and she's also an advocate with a domestic violence shelter. So, Lyndsay, we're coming up on, we're a little bit after 10 o'clock, which is fine with me, but do you have any other, I guess, huge thoughts of what we should know, what we should do or not do? Everyone talks about um, when you decide to leave is the most dangerous time, right prior to or right after. So, what words of advice can you give someone who's out there? Number one, to someone who may just be figuring out that they are in an abusive relationship, what would you tell them um, if they're listening?
Oh, wow. Well, I mean, first of all, I always want survivors to know that this is not your fault. Um, if, usually when you get to the point of realizing that this abuse, it's been going on for a while and you've exhausted, a lot of problem solving options. And so I just kind of want people to know that this isn't your fault and you can't be responsible for someone else's behaviors. You are only responsible for your own safety and well-being, and of course any your children or any dependents that you have. So as much as the abuser has probably told you that somehow this is your fault and that if you can't leave them because you have some responsibility to take care of them too, don't listen to that. Try to remember at your core the most important thing is your own safety and your kids and dependent safety, and well-being and happiness. Those are the only things you're responsible for. So starting there, try to get a support network in place. You can borrow somebody's phone. You can call Greenhouse 17 24 hours a day. If you're in central Kentucky, or if you're outside of here, they'll probably just refer you to your region. But that number is 1-800-544-2022. And you can talk to somebody. You can stay anonymous if you don't want to tell them your name or anything. And they should be able to hook you up with some information and resources. Yeah, I mean, that's, I kind of think the most important place to start is being able to reach out to support systems. And if you don't have people in your life, in your immediate circle that you feel comfortable talking to, you can talk to an advocate at any time and be able to kind of find a place to start, how to plan how you're going to.
I was going to say, start the planning process, because you don't want the individual to know, but at the same time, it may not be a plan that can take place a week later. It may take a little bit longer, especially as you mentioned earlier, when the financial aspect isn't present, then, or you don't have the financial means, then it means going to a shelter and doing things that are way outside of maybe where you thought you might end up, leaving someone like that. And some people decide to stay because going to a shelter seems like, oh my gosh, I can't believe let this go so far, or it's so bad. What can you tell us just briefly about, I guess, what it might be like to live in the shelter? What does it look like? What does it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're very lucky here. Greenhouse 17 is a beautiful facility, and they've definitely put a lot of, money and time and love into trying to make it feel more like a home than like a shelter or community living. Um, so, it's definitely like it's like a big house, more or less. There's a community dining area, but folks that are residents there have a room. They might have one roommate. I think I'm not totally. Don't hold me to this, I guess, because I'm not exactly
No,
sure.
and we know circumstances may vary
Yeah,
based on situation, based on numbers.
yeah.
Mm.
And it depends on if somebody has kids, and they're probably gonna have their own separate room, because just privacy and space and everything. But it really is wonderful people working there that care about survivors and want to empower folks to be able to take the next steps that they and figure out what that is, if they're not sure where to even start. um, so it's a beautiful location. If you go to greenhouse17.org, they have a great website, and you can kind of see a little bit of what it looks like over there. It's a working farm, so of course we're winding down to end of the growing season now.
Okay.
But in the spring, summer, and early fall, there's all types of things being grown out there, in the greenhouses, flowers, vegetables, you name it. Um, and so it's just a really great, healing environment, and a place that people can kind of start over. So I don't want anyone to, yeah, it's hard sometimes to explain to folks who have a certain idea in mind. They might have had a bad experience at a homeless shelter or something, that
That's
it's
what I was
not.
going to say. That's what you think. You think about the fact that I'm leaving this relationship and I'm already broke and I'm homeless and I'm going to go live in a shelter. And you think about living in a shelter that's for homeless.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but, and I just want to say, my own situation, I lost the home I lived in. Lord knows Lyndsay attempted to save the day more than once with utilities and things like that. But I did eventually, because of the pandemic and all of the abuse and the financial abuse, I lost a home. My car was repoed. Lost my job. I mean, it's again,
Mm-hmm.
the consequences can start to fall into place once the abuse cycle is in place, and that's just part of rebuilding.
Yeah.
Someone asked the question, can men call that abuse hotline?
Yes, definitely. There's
Okay.
no. They do have, the shelter has at least one area that's like a larger family room for um, men, that if you have kids or something with you, they definitely provide all of these same services to men.
Do
it
they stay at the same facility
it is
as
the
the
same
women?
facility, but it is, depending on availability, since it is a limited area, it's just that one kind of the suite that they have for
Okay.
families, that they can put men into, because they want to make sure they have their own private area.
Right.
But there are other shelters also, and outreach services, that Greenhouse works with, to make sure that male survivors and or non-female survivors also have the same options available to
Right.
them as far as support and resources go.
Okay. Okay. Um, well, I want to say, for those of you who are listening, um, in order to begin to gain clarity, you have to gain some knowledge and information. You have to begin to put together the puzzle. And when you start to put together the puzzle, you have to, and it's hard. It's one of the hardest things you'll do, and that is reaching out and asking for help, especially when sometimes and many times the abuser will say, often, no one's going to believe you. Everyone knows I'm so nice. Everyone knows me this way. They're not going to believe you. They're not going to, take you serious. But you have to begin to trust someone somewhere for some reason, doing something or saying something, and that can be the hardest step.
Mm-hmm.
And then there will be other hard steps, but rebuilding takes time. But even in a shelter, even living with friends, doing whatever you have to do, I know for me, even though it's been difficult, being free from abuse has been more of a blessing than any day I could have stayed. I'm not going to tell you that I didn't stay for a long time, but once you figure it out and you can make those steps to go, it's obviously it's obviously a better deal in the end, but getting there. And you have to think about your own safety, and at what point do some abusers cross the cross what I call the snap line. I don't we don't know. There's no way to know. um, I just want to say thank you to Lyndsay for being our guest tonight on Love Over Coffee. Voices Now Heard. This is a platform and a podcast for the marginalized, the silenced, and the abused. Um, Tomorrow night, we will be giving an update for the Gabby Petito case. There have been some more developments. Of course, it was Gabby Petito's case that brought about the 31 nights. So I do want to spend at least one night actually bringing her case up to date. Um, we have some other guests coming up over the course of the next, what today's the 20th, right? So we
Yeah,
have
11 days.
11 days. Wow. So, if you have any questions for Lyndsay, you're welcome to message me. I'm sure if Lyndsay doesn't have the answer, she can certainly help point us and me in the direction of resources. Of course, I know that when you go to some domestic sites online, it'll say click this X so that when you click it, there is no history that you have searched for the website. So that's a way, again, to stay safe and be protected. Um, I think that's it. Any
Yes.
other final words?
Um, no, just hope everybody stays safe and um, reach out if you have questions. Like Tina said, I'm happy to answer any questions. If I don't know the answer, I will try my best to find it for you.
Okay.
And I really enjoyed being on your podcast and live stream, and I appreciate you having me as a guest. Thank you.
Well, you're most welcome. I'm so glad that we met, not under the best of circumstances, but survivors make the best of situations, sometimes after the fact. So
Amen.
I am happy to have met you through the support group that I attended. Listening to the power cycle was really good, because I needed to be reminded of some of those things, and remember, as you look back, as you look forward, you also must look back, because, as we've said before, some of your own trauma, um, and healing that trauma can lead you into healthier relationships rather than these more abusive ones.
Hmm.
And not to say that you own the abuse, but you've got to own the healing.
Hmm.
So I have a subscription box for self love and self care and healing trauma. It's called Love Over Coffee, Reclaiming Self. So if that is something you're interested in, check out the link tree. Let me know if you have any questions. The box is getting ready to go out next week after I put the final touches on it. And so I'm here to do what I can to bring awareness and to help others. So thank you again, Lyndsay. I hope to see you next year, but I hope to see you maybe before the year.
Yeah, totally. I
we
hope
both we
sooner.
both get busy and doing our own thing. So I'm going to go ahead and end the live on TikTok. So I want to say thank you again for everyone on TikTok. Thanks for the love and the likes and the shares and the gifts. And I want to say thank you to everyone who stopped by, as well as my moderators, which are Sue, Cat Links, Angel, and Nicole. So thank you very much. And Mar may be a mod, but I can't keep up. So, and I apologize for the hand that covers up the microphone sometimes. So, unfortunately, I'm not able to stream to TikTok yet. So, take care, everybody, and I will see you in a little bit later because we're going to be crafting around 11 o'clock tonight. So, see you online later for some self love and self care. Take care. Bye. All right. And so now I am going to say goodbye to everyone on Real Change, on the YouTube page, and all the other good places. So thank you again for tuning in, and we'll be back tomorrow night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.
Bye.